Hello class, welcome back. Today we are taking a look at project development. So one of the early phases you'll be responsible for as a project manager. Let's get right into it. All right. So project development is really about defining the project and taking some early steps to getting it going. So when I say define the project, what I really mean is the what, when, and where, and then some preliminary goals and actions. We'll go into what those are in a moment. But some of the very key things to accomplish at this stage are establishing a budget for the project and establishing a mock schedule for the project. Obviously, those things will change over time as you learn more, but it is important to conceptualize the project in that way early on. One note that I make at the bottom of the screen here is that it's essential that you document your process. You know, if you were to leave your organization in the middle of a project, you would want to be sure that everything was documented such that somebody else could pick up the ball and run with it. You know, it's also really important to document your work as a project manager in case the public has questions or, God forbid, you're audited by a funder. So it's a question of protecting the project first and then protecting yourself second. Okay, so some of the things that you do initially to establish a workflow consists of the following. Site analysis. I've mentioned this before. It's important to get out on the site and begin to visualize what's possible there, and we'll take a closer look at that in a minute. Then there's this concept of light build. This is from page 38 in your textbook. I rather like this. I've never used this term professionally, but I've done this work professionally. It's when you imagine your dream project with no limitations. So imagine that there were no issues with funding, no issues with permitting, no issues with contrary neighbors or political discontent. Just your dream project, knowing what you know about the potential of a site. It's really important to start with that and then back up towards something more realistic. You know, funders for projects do not want you to come to them later on and say, hey, we just thought of this additional widget we can add to the project. Wouldn't that be great? They'd much rather you ask for everything up front the first time. It's very unlikely that they will fund piecemeal over time. It's best to dream big, make it realistic, and then ask for everything you think is possible. So that's light build. You know, another important part of the initial workflow is just additional site assessment, going out there again and again and refining your goals. Some things that people occasionally do as part of project development is they'll implement field trials of new techniques. You know, maybe there's a new type of weed control that you want to test out. So you better do that early on before you go big with that. You know, it's essential to demonstrate the utility of a new technique before you build it into grant applications and before you go use it on a larger scale. And that's something that I've seen done. Also, this may be a good time to seek out and characterize a reference site. A reference site is a site similar to the one you want to restore that's already in natural condition. Ideally, it was never altered by humans. So it is a picturesque, naturally functioning ecosystem. Now, in reality, those very rarely exist anymore. I know from my work that we had a heck of a time finding reference sites. Usually, the best we could do is find a site that restored itself um, through natural events, maybe 50, 60 years ago. And we would have to assume that that's as close to natural as we're going to be able to find in the immediate vicinity. That's still useful because if you understand the ecology at that site, then you may have a notion as to what's possible at your um, altered and low functioning site that you want to restore. So reference sites are something that we will definitely come back to in some of our case studies and examples. Okay, where are we going with this? What is the homework for the project manager? What is the deliverable that they need to produce at the end of the project development phase? The scope statement. Basically, this is a packet of material where you have the opportunity, or your group has the opportunity, to summarize the whole project definition process, lay out very clear goals and objectives, lay out your draft budget and schedule, um, and just talk about the overriding design requirements that you're going to need to implement to be successful there. So you might include a conceptual design, a very generic design that will get refined later on. If you're in the ground version of this course, you'll actually get an opportunity to work in groups to prepare a scope statement for a potential project. It is not a small amount of work, but usually as a project manager, you're relying on a team, and so you'll split up the responsibilities within that team. But that scope statement is really essential to laying the groundwork for implementation. So if you do a really good job during this phase, do all your research and develop these materials responsibly, then you'll just be able to cut and paste or copy and paste into grant applications, into permit applications, etc. So you'll be much more positioned to get the ball rolling. Okay, before you can ever get to a scoping packet, the first thing you need to do is, with your team, develop the problem statement. And this is where communicating with the landowner and getting out on site is really important. You want to essentially identify and describe the missing or underperforming ecological functions at a site. This could really be just about anything. It depends on what kind of work you're doing. For me, it was often working on wetlands. It was often, a lack of off-channel habitat for juvenile salmon, or a lack of natural seed sources to be exported into the lower Columbia because these wetlands were cut off. But, your problem statement could be anything from maintaining the local gene pool to a lack of habitat for pollinators like bees. It could be an erosion problem. It could be a groundwater recharge problem. It could really just be about anything. But your problem statement is the opportunity to succinctly capture that problem in one or two sentences. That is closely followed by a mission statement. Now, a mission statement is a little different. This is a concise statement, again, just a couple of sentences, where you describe your group and your group's purpose in doing this work. This gives funders and gives stakeholders confidence that you all are organized and that you have established a team that is capable of attacking the problem. So a mission statement is also a very essential piece of your scoping document. All right, so regardless of whether you're in the online course and or the ground course, what I need you all to do now is take 5 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, after I've described a case study, and in your notebook, make some notes on missing or underperforming ecosystem functions, restoration goals, stakeholders, and project team with respect to this case study. So we're going to get you to start thinking like a project manager who's just been introduced to a site and just introduced to a problem. I'll come back to this slide and give you time to work on it, but let me describe the case study. All right. So this is one I'm very intimately familiar with, having done some restoration work here. This is Lewis and Clark National Historic Park in the Lower Columbia River Estuary. This is the Lewis and Clark River running through the middle of the frame. And here we have Fort Clatsop Road. This is all National Park property now on the left side of the river, whereas this is private over here. This is a dairy farm over here on the right side of the river. So the Lewis and Clark National Historic Park initially began as a replica fort. It's where Lewis and Clark overwintered on their historic journey to the sea and back. But it expanded over time. They acquired a lot of neighboring property, and a lot of that was old farmland, disused and abused farmland, and then a whole lot of timber country in various states. They are currently working on thinning that forest and trying to restore it to a natural condition. What they wanted my help on was organizing a team to restore these floodplains that had been converted to agriculture many, many decades ago. And this is a nice example. So let's say west or left of Fort Clatsop Road, everything you see here is derelict pasture, and there's an old farm home right there. There used to be a stream that connected to the Lewis and Clark River, but it was cut off with a tide gate. And a tide gate is just a structure that allows for artificial drainage of the land behind the tide gate. So it allows water, flood water out, but it does not allow the tide to come in and inundate those wetlands anymore. So essentially, it's a means through which farmers were able to drain the land and convert these wetlands to agriculture. And in this area, it's so wet that traditional row crops were not really viable, and most of the time it ended up just being grazing land. And then in this case, it sat idle for a really long time, really not helping anybody because it was a weedy patch, whereas in the old days, before mankind got involved, it would have been a thriving wetland with lots of sinewy tidal channels, lots of opportunities for juvenile salmon coming down the Columbia River to get up in here and take refuge and fatten up and hide from predators prior to going out to sea. Because remember, of course, that salmon are anadromous, and it's important that they have habitats as juveniles to transition to ocean life before they come back and spawn a few years later. So in any case, the park was very interested in returning this to a naturally performing wetland, closer to what Lewis and Clark would have encountered when they were here. So what we have is a tide gate that's failing. It's not doing its job very well. So some of this wetland here is pretty marshy, but has a lot of invasives, and you can see it has old drainage ditches which are, of course, artificial features that affect the hydrology. And then over here, we have another piece of pasture that is artificially high. So it has been raised with material, with mud, dredged out of the river to keep it a little drier yet. And that was also a very common practice. So there you have it. You have a floodplain that's disconnected from its river. And also you have this nice stream that could provide spawning habitat for adult salmon returning. But it, of course, is cut off, and the habitat up there is going unused, at least by salmon. There are definitely other species, local species like elk, lots of birds, that do utilize this habitat, but would utilize it even more if it were restored to its former condition. So what I want you to do is pause the video and make some notes on what you got out of my little speech just then. What are the underperforming or missing ecosystem functions? What are the restoration goals? What is the potential here? Who might be the stakeholders? And think carefully about what I said about ownership. And then, of course, who might you want on your project team? Which of those stakeholders, what kind of professionals would you put on a team that is working to restore this landscape? Okay, so take a moment, pause, make some notes, because you will be turning this in to me later. All right, so we're going to move on. Hopefully you paused and made some good notes. I'm not going to give you all the answers except to say that this is a case study we're going to return to a couple times, and you're going to learn a lot more about it because you'll get to see not only project development through the lens of this case study, but also project permitting, project implementation, etc. And I think that's all I'll say for now. I do want you to do one more thing here before we leave this case study, and that's to ask some questions of your potential stakeholders. So in my mind, the stakeholders here are the park staff, and by proxy, because it's a national park, also the public, because this is public land. There are no immediate private landowners as neighbors. So really your primary stakeholder is the national park, and you need to help them meet their mission. We'll take a moment to again pause and have a look at the bottom, page 40 and 41 of your textbook, and look at those questions that are typical questions you ask when you interview stakeholders, and think about those questions with respect to this case study I just presented you, South Slough, and see how you would modify those questions and make a few notes on that as well. And you'll be turning those in as well. Okay, so moving on. I mentioned this before, but consensus is really difficult to reach, even when it's a slam dunk project that everyone agrees on. Invariably, someone is going to want to do the project differently than you are, and it is important to compromise. And there's a nice example of that compromise process with the Cape May case study in your textbook. This is page 41. So I really encourage you to read that if you haven't already, or reread it, thinking about how you would take leadership in seeking compromise for a tricky restoration situation. But now we're going to move on to goals and objectives. So goals and objectives, it seems pretty dry, but it is a really important part of this project development process. you're defining what project success would look like. Um, you again reiterate the problem, the mission, and then you talk about the end goal. This really forms a framework for all the steps to come. And let's have a look at what your goals and objectives need to achieve. Your goals need to be very strategic and attainable. The last thing you want to do is promise something that is too big or too broad or too generic. They need to be attainable. You need to deliver on those goals by the end of the project. Now, objectives are a little different. They are more specific and measurable. So this goes back to that controlling process, being able to measure the success of your efforts and circling back and changing something if it isn't successful. So objectives are tactical. You need to be able to measure them. And finally, actions. This is like one level even more specific, in which you define discrete tasks that you can put on a calendar, that you can schedule. So big picture goals. Beneath that you have objectives, and beneath that you have adjectives, and we'll look at that in a minute. What does this all do? Well, it establishes long-term outcomes. Keep in mind that sometimes projects take 5-10 years to implement, and then another 5-10 years to really mature into a self-sustaining ecosystem. So you want to demonstrate consistency throughout that time frame, and you want to have consistent communication with your stakeholders, and just uniformity to your actions that are testable. And again, that serves the project and it serves you. So here's a nice schematic that, or conceptual model of what this process looks like. So we have our restoration project, the title of our project up top. Beneath that, we have goal number 1 and goal number 2. These are things that are going to allow you to accomplish your mission. So in the case that we just looked at with South Slough, one goal might be to hydraulically reconnect the tide to that piece of floodplain. Beneath that, you can have objectives that are much more specific. And we'll talk about what makes a proper objective statement on the next slide. But notice that beneath that are your very specific line item actions that can be scheduled and delegated to your team members and to your consultants and to your contractors. Objective statements, that middle task, are a little tricky. That's why we use this handy-dandy acronym, this SMART objective statement. And you may have encountered this in other classes or in your workplace. It's pretty ubiquitous. SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time specified. So let's look at those independently. Specific, this might be identifying a species group of plants that is missing from your restoration site. So, it could be that you need to reestablish willows along a stream, for example. Measurable, this is the location or the quantity of willows that you want to put in the ground. Attainable, just make sure it's reasonable. Don't promise to plant 10,000 seedlings if that's cost prohibitive or too time intensive or you can't irrigate them. Results oriented. This is where you track your progress and make sure that you're achieving that objective. And then finally, T for time specified. You want to make sure that your objective has a target date so that you can push it to get done by that time. So smart objectives are really important. It's a really important skill to develop, and you'll no doubt be asked to do this in your workplace no matter what direction you go. So here is another exercise. I want you to turn in these answers to. What I'd like you to do is replicate this schematic using the Cowden Preserve case study on pages 43 to 45. So this may take 10 to 15 minutes, but you're going to essentially digest that information about that project and then assign goals and objectives and actions to this chart. Okay, it could be hand-drawn, that's totally fine. You can take a picture of it and upload it. We'll provide instructions on the assignment. But go ahead and pause and have a look at that and work on that now. Okay, as we move along, one of the last and more important things we need to cover is risk assessment. So risk assessment is pretty simple. It's just where you brainstorm what could possibly go wrong in each phase of the project management lifecycle. And remember those lifecycle phases, what are they? Their planning, their implementation, their aftercare. That should sound familiar. Well, you want to think about each of those phases and determine what the technical risks are and the environmental risks. So technical risks, this could be as simple as you don't have enough staff to get this thing done on time. So it could be a capacity issue, for example. Environmental risks, this has much more to do with the site itself. Perhaps the site is prone to flooding, and it's debatable whether you're going to be able to get equipment out there safely. That's an environmental risk, something to do with the site. You know, common obstacles, and the book does a nice job of capturing these on page 27. Common obstacles to any restoration project include natural hazards like the flooding I just mentioned, management and technical issues. You know, maybe it's a really tricky restoration project where you don't have 100% confidence in the modeling that informed the design. Schedule, you know, maybe the schedule is just too tight. If one thing goes wrong, you're going to miss your construction window. And then finally, cost. You know, I've definitely walked away from plenty of very good project ideas just because I knew I wouldn't be able to secure all the funding needed. And sometimes you just put that on a shelf and then funders down the road find money for it, or they have a surplus in a given fiscal year that they want to spend. And that's happened to me as well. So project development does not always yield an immediate project. Very often you develop a project and it idles for a while until you can move it forward. But these are just some of the common obstacles that restoration practitioners encounter. Have a look at page 27 and you'll see a lot more specific examples, and that's a really good thing to get familiar with, because your job as a project manager is to anticipate all these risks and then rank them, you know, and deal with the high risk ones first. So there's an appendix in your textbook with a form for risk assessment that you would take with you into the field. And you would walk around and you would try to identify all the risks that fall into these categories and then assign them either L, M, or H for low, medium, high risk. And then rank those so that you can prioritize addressing those risks. This is really essential. And again, it's something that project managers neglect to do far too often. And, you know, sometimes you get away with it and then sometimes you don't. And some risk that you didn't account for comes back to haunt you. So don't let that happen to you. Do your risk assessment as part of your project development scoping. I talked about this already, but essentially you're assigning a probability to each risk. You multiply your high, medium, low assessment times a probability, like a percentage that like if you think it's 70% possible, then that's pretty high. If it's, it's a risk, but it's 5% likely to happen, then maybe it's pretty low on the list and you don't need to worry about it. But you're just ranking these probabilities and developing countermeasures, backup plans, basically. It's your responsibility to not put these on the shelf, but to share these risks with your project team and your stakeholders and maybe even the sponsor. So, my work involved a lot of implementation on behalf of Bonneville Power for their mitigation requirements. And, very often if a project was deemed risky, we'd have very honest conversations with BPA about that because we needed them to be clear-headed about whether to fund it or not, and to understand what their tolerance of risk is. I'm going to skip beyond this. This is just to show that there's a lot of different forms and equations and spreadsheets out there to help with risk assessment, but essentially you're doing the same thing. Okay, so let's review. What's in a scope statement? Again, this is that packet of material that you need to develop early on as part of the project development phase. It's your goals, your SMART objectives, your actions, so that chart that I had you work on. It's your requirements. So what actions are absolutely required to start and finish this project? What in-between milestones do you need to achieve to get there? It's really important that you lay out very clearly to the funder, for example, that the following things are necessary for us to be successful. And emphasize that you can't leave any of those out of the design in order to achieve success. All right, stakeholder approvals. So very often this is just signed letters from the stakeholders saying they're on board. A preliminary schedule. We'll talk about scheduling more. A proposed budget. We'll certainly get some practice at that as well. Assumptions. So, in my case, we don't know everything about juvenile salmon life history. We certainly did not know if our little wetland projects here and there were going to add up to any kind of measurable increase in population survival. So there are some assumptions that you need to lay out there, just so you're not claiming to know everything. And finally, you need to attach that risk assessment and risk management plan that we just covered. All right, that does it for project development. As always, I look forward to your questions and comments, and I look forward to seeing the results of your work this week. Thank you so much for your attention. We'll see you soon.